Hey, everybody, welcome back to You're Free to Go. We're glad to have you with us again today. And I'm in the studio in Boca Raton, Florida. And Mark Nurick, my partner in crime, literally, is in California. So, welcome, Mark. How's everything out there?
Everything's great. It is a bit of a gloomy morning, which is unusual for Southern California, but I think it'll burn off.
You,
But
did,
anxious to get going today.
did you actually have to put the roof up on your convertible or no?
I didn't get a chance to drive yet. It's
Uh,
only 8:35 in the morning.
that's true. That's true. And also, I think it's been like 5 years since you put the roof up on that thing. So you have such
That's
perfect
true.
weather.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
good.
that's why we pay more taxes, pay through
For-
the nose for real estate, and gas is $1.50 to $2 more than yours
oh boy.
a gallon.
All right. Well, we'd welcome you back any day. Florida's missing you. So,
Well, I'll be
yeah.
back there in a couple of weeks, and we'll do some more episodes.
Awesome. Can't wait. Can't wait. And of course, I think today you're going to welcome us or walk us into our today's topic. But two things first, I want to remind all our followers to like, follow, and subscribe. People think it costs money, but it does not. It's free, and our show keeps growing. So we appreciate everyone listening to the podcast, and we appreciate that our listeners are following us, subscribing, liking, and so forth. Today, we'll start with another question. The last couple episodes, we've been starting with a little brief question. Today's a simple one. Actually, it didn't come from a viewer. It came from a parent of a client recently, of a juvenile client, and their son was arrested for having a fake ID. And so when they asked me the question, I realized that's a question actually over the years has come up a lot. Like, what's the deal with a fake ID? So I just want our viewers to know, because sometimes we like this to be somewhat educational as well as entertaining. On the educational side of things, if a fake ID is it's kind of portraying a government ID, an official state identification card like a driver's license, of course, a passport or an official ID card. That can actually be a felony, believe it or not. And felonies are punishable by up to life in prison. Misdemeanors are just the ones that are up to a year. So the felonies are the more serious crimes. So it is a very serious crime. If it's not a state government ID, if it's not trying to portray a government ID, then it's a misdemeanor. So let's say you have a University of Wisconsin school ID with a date of birth on it and it makes you old enough to drink alcohol. Well, that is a misdemeanor because it's not an official state or government ID. So we do see some of those out there. Or let's say you belong to some type of country club or any Costco or some type of club that gives you an ID and there happens to be a date of birth on there. That would be a misdemeanor. So we see these a lot, but I want parents out there listening to know that if your child gets a charge for having a fake ID, as long as they have no other criminal history, it's not going to ruin the rest of their life. It's not going to foreclose any opportunities for them to go to college or to one day get a mortgage on a home or get a loan to open a business. Most likely, again, if they have no other history and they were respectful to the police but just got this citation, which is a criminal citation for the fake ID, most likely they'll show up in court. You should get a lawyer because you always need to have proper counsel representing you, or else it could go sideways on your child very quickly. But get a lawyer, go to court, and I'm sure they'll work it out. The Bar Association, the Florida Bar, the American Bar, the California Bar, they don't allow us lawyers to guarantee an outcome. No one has a crystal ball, of course. But from all of my years of experience, and Mark, I'm sure would agree, the outcome is going to be very benign. Usually it's something like write an essay about the importance of following the law, stay out of trouble for a few months, and then, we'll drop your case for like a fake ID. So anyway, parents, don't be alarmed. Your child didn't destroy their future, but at the same time, make sure they understand that having a fake ID is a crime and will be prosecuted. So that's the answer to the mother who reached out to me the other day for her son, who I'm representing, and other parents over the last 35 years who have asked me that question. Now, Mark, I'll let you introduce the topic for today because I know you're pretty
Well,
excited about
today's
it.
topic, thank you. Today's topic is going to be somewhat timely. I think very timely. And it deals with what we would simply call politically charged or politically motivated prosecutions. And the most recent being the Comey case. James Comey, former director of the FBI, recently indicted for intending for threatening the life of the president. We'll get into that in a minute, but let's just talk about from a background point of view. There's always the danger that when you have prosecutions that are motivated politically, that our country degenerates into the realm of what were traditionally called banana republics, countries, and mostly in the third world, where when a new administration, a new ruler, sometimes a dictator, sometimes popularly elected, although there's always a doubt as to whether it was a legitimate election or not, when those new rulers come in, they immediately go after their predecessors, usually rivals or opponents that they have serious problems with. Sometimes violence is involved. And they go after them. They go after them in terms of arresting them. The more benign, do it through the legal process. The more overt, do it through death, dismemberment, or you know,
Or, you
kidnapping, whatever. And what happens is they not only go after them in the legal process, criminally prosecuting them, they also uh, seize assets around the world that they may have, because a lot of times in these countries, leading administrations or rob the treasury
true. And
and enrich themselves.
but I know you kind of started that by saying other countries, Banana Republic and so forth. We really haven't seen that in the U.S. Over history. Like, is that a new thing happening here in the U.S., Mark? Seems like it is to
Well,
me.
I think if you study history, you'll see there are examples of that in the past, but it seems to be more prevalent now than ever.
Right.
And also with the fact that news is instantaneous now, um, people are more aware of what's going on.
True.
And so it seems like things are happening more frequently. But of course, it is a violation of our basic rights, our basic freedoms, and more importantly, the Constitution and the right to equal protection under law. And it damages not only our republic in terms of the rule of law and the sense that people would have or hope to have that the system is fair, but it also degenerates our reputation in the world. Instead of being the leading beacon of justice and fairness and a democratic process and judicial system that, frankly, is if not the best, one of the best in the world, it lends itself to the possibility that people look at us that we've really lost our way. And so, with that in mind, um, I think you have an example. And by the way, this is not limited to any party, any
Right.
one party, any one administration. I think the danger of it is that it happens both from Democratic administrations and Republican
Right.
administrations. And
Yep.
so you have an example to tell us
Well,
about.
and I do, but before we go into that, Mark, what's interesting to me is that if someone gets indicted and prosecuted and even sentenced to prison due to a politically charged case, and a year or two later, there's an election and the party, changes, that person often gets pardoned or their sentence gets commuted, and it's kind of like a revolving door. It's like a weird process that you get thrown in jail by an opposing party, and then your party comes into power and they release you, and it's just I don't know. And also, look, a president, no president should be above the law. Of course, we're all should be held accountable under the law, no matter who you are, what position you hold, if you don't hold a position, what your socioeconomic status is, and so forth. But there is, I think you kind of touched on it. There's a stigma or there's optics of that others around the world will form certain opinions that are usually adverse, negative, and so forth. If you see a president being indicted, that's happened over the years, I think to myself, if I were, if a president, and would I pardon a prior president, who was under investigation or got indicted? There's just it's an interesting, I think, dilemma for a leader to be in, because it's for the country, for the reputation of the country, it's never good if you see your leaders being indicted. But at the same time, to keep the justice system working properly, we have to hold everyone accountable. So, so really,
Well,
yeah,
yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and it's you're perfectly right. Of course, in recent history, I don't know how recent you would claim this is, but back in the 70s, when President Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, who, by the way, at that point in time, had not been formally charged with the crime, but it was as a result of the Watergate scandal. He pardoned him, and people were aghast at it. It was debated heavily, both in the media and privately,
yeah,
uh, whether or not this was the right thing to do. Now, Ford's justification is that it was time to move on and save the country from what could have been a very distracting and destructive process, because it looked like Nixon was, if memory serves me, was close to being indicted. And I think looking back historically, it was the right decision
right,
by Ford. But keep in mind that a president can only pardon someone or commute the sentence of someone who is charged with, or about to be charged, or will be charged with a federal crime.
right,
If you're charged in state court, the president has no power over that. The only power resides in the head of that particular state, which would be the governor of that state,
sure.
typically.
Yep.
So,
And I agree
in
with
any event,
you.
I want to get
No,
for
I
our
got
viewers
one more
to
second. One
your
more second.
story.
One more
Okay.
second. I agree with you on Ford. By the way, the cautionary tale there, or the catch-22, is a president doesn't want to set a precedent. That's funny, the play on words, for future presidents. If a future president thinks, I'll get pardoned if I cross the line and do some things bad. Ford did it for Nixon, and what Nixon did was horrible. It's a real catch-22 that you don't want presidents taking office, having all that power, and thinking, I can cross the line and do something illegal because, no big deal, I'll get pardoned. So but I did think Ford did the right thing in that case. It comes down to the rule of justice, I guess, and so forth. And I want, before we get into another topic a case I want to talk about that involves the government, you referenced, James Comey. Just so our listeners, I think most people know he was the FBI director. But as I understand it, Mark, this was his second indictment. If he had one like in 2025 in Virginia for some false statements, but this current one, which I think the behavior allegedly occurred in 2025, but the indictment occurred this year in 2026. Didn't it have to do with him posting a picture of seashells that he had laid out and to say the number 86 and 47? And so from that, they took it to a grand jury to say that he was threatening the president of the United States.
Yes,
Yeah,
and that's exactly what happened. And the event was the posting of a photograph on the internet, on Instagram specifically,
right,
depicting seashells that were arranged in a pattern that made out 86, 47. 86 referring to a phrase that I understood was, when I learned it, used in the restaurant business, meaning 86 on the roast beef or 86 on this, 86, we're out of it.
right,
We don't have any more. And 47 is referring to the designation of the president, the 47th president, which clearly would indicate Trump. And then that occurred on May 15th, 2025, a year ago.
right.
And now he is indicted for knowingly and willfully making a threat to take the life of and to inflict bodily harm upon the president of the United States.
Okay, what are first of all, it was North Carolina. Maybe there's some political reasons out of, but also, what's your opinion? I mean, there's freedom of speech. At what point does freedom of speech cross the line? First of all,
Well, clearly,
it could have been his birthday and his daughter's birthday, like his age and his daughter, like could have been anything. But how does this become a crime, Mark?
Well, understand, first of all, that I don't think there's any doubt that the seashells arranged in the way they were referring to the current president, President Trump. I don't think that's the issue, though. The issue is, did James Brian Comey Jr. Uh, actually intend to make a threat to take the life of and inflict bodily harm upon President Trump? And that's what the statute that he's charged with, and there are two charges actually, we'll get to the second in a minute. That's what the statute he's charged with is intended to punish.
Right.
Now, free speech, we all know, those of us who've gone to law school, and you don't even need to be a lawyer to know, free speech has its limits. The First Amendment, like all amendments, have their limits. And when it crosses the line, in this case, threatening the life of the president, as alleged, then it no longer is protected by the First Amendment. It's considered a crime. And the reasons behind this are obvious. Whether you are a fan of any particular politician or president or public figure, clearly threatening their life is something that is and should be a crime. And in this particular, if you have the intent, and that's the key issue here,
Right.
and that's what we'll get to in a minute. Um, but underlying all this is the question of, why did it take a year to do this? Why did it take a year to indict the man? And that lends itself to the possibility that this is a vindictive prosecution. And the prosecutors in this particular case claimed that it was being investigated.
Hmm.
Now, what kind of investigation do you really need to do here? I mean, you've got the seashells, which, by the way, nobody's claiming he actually arranged the seashells. He walked by, as I understand the story. And by the way, right after he posted this, he was um, questioned by federal agents. I think it may have been the Secret Service, within a day or two after. And he obviously denied that he had any intent
Right.
to, in fact, threaten the life. Um, so, why did it take a year for this to happen? Now, we do know it's well publicized that Donald Trump, President Trump, um, did publicly make statements questioning why certain of his political enemies, one of them is Comey, were not indicted, and this has been well publicized, and that he has, in fact, pressured, as it is reported, um, his attorney general in the past to take action against these people. So the first line of attack that any defense attorney will have in this case will be to argue that this is a vindictive prosecution. But the combination of the fact that nothing was done at the time when this occurred, that only after repeated pressure publicly reported by the president on the Justice Department to prosecute, did this prosecution actually occur.
Right.
The other issue is going to be whether or not the indictment itself actually states a crime, because arguments will be made that the indictment lacks an essential element of the crime, which is that the speaker, in this case, Mr. Comey, intended to threaten violence, that he had the intent or acted with in conscious disregard of substantial risk that the communication would be viewed as a threat. That's the standard that the Supreme Court of the United States has attached to this particular statute. Curiously, the indictment does not allege that he had the intent, simply said that he knowingly and willfully made a threat. I don't believe personally, as a lawyer of 50 years, that that is sufficient to make out the elements of a crime.
Right.
And then the other question is, the other issue is whether or not the grand jury was properly instructed as to what the legal standard is. Because remember, a grand jury consists of the individuals sitting as grand jurors, um, a minimum, I believe, of 16, It may be less. I have to double check that. It's been a while. But they sit in a room. There is a reporter, a court reporter there. There is no judge. There is no defense attorney. It's merely the prosecutor. Prosecutor has full control of what happens,
Yep.
but the prosecutor has obligations to present evidence fairly and has obligations to present the law, charge the law to the jurors to what they must consider when they view the evidence. And then he presents a drafted indictment, which he reads to them and instructs them on the law. And then they vote and return either a true bill, which is they uphold the indictment, or a not true, no true bill, which means they will not indict.
Right. There's
So in this case,
never any defense
ahead.
presented, right, Mark, in these grand jury?
No, I mean,
Never.
look, we all know that the prosecutors a lot of times invite the target to testify on his or her behalf in front of the grand jury. Usually, it's insane for a defense attorney to allow his or her client to do that because you don't go in the room with them and you can't control what the prosecutor's asking.
Right.
Can't control the fairness of the process. There's no judge there at that moment. Nobody could object to the question and have the judge rule. So it's a one-way street. And I think it's insane to have your client do it. I have in the past, on one or two occasions, done it, but there are always special circumstances. In this particular case, it does not appear that Mr. Comey went before the grand jury. And so what we have here, viewed by most, is a politically charged indictment. My my prediction is, and I'm not a
Huh.
one to predict, but in this particular case, I will. My prediction is this indictment will be thrown out
Right. So why would,
long before a trial ever occurs.
understanding that there are politically charged indictments and criminal prosecutions and so forth, nevertheless, why would, even with that motivation, why would the government bring a case that they don't, that's really not a strong case? I mean, they probably sit there thinking it is a strong case, but I agree with you. I think it's a very weak case. It's curious that the intent, condition or element of the crime has been left out of the charging document. So, do you have any feel for why you think the government would bring a case like that? If it's like, I always say the case only as good as the facts, right? So if you're going to try to make a point, bring a case that has the facts behind it. This is probably the wrong, if they really wanted to go after former FBI, Director Comey, it seems like, they should have waited for a matter that had stronger facts behind it. But
Well,
why?
I don't know what they have besides the seashell. If you take the Assistant Attorney General Todd Blanche, who, by the way, is a very intelligent, excellent lawyer. Um, if you take him at his word, is what he said at the press conference, they have been investigating this, which would suggest to me um, that they would have spoken to a person or persons that Mr. Comey spoke to, in which, in an ideal situation for the prosecutor, the slam dunk for the prosecutor is that Comey would have said to someone close to him or somebody he knows, yeah, I intended for this to reflect that I wanted somebody to assassinate, or I
Right.
intended that the president be assassinated,
Mm.
or I knew that there was a substantial risk that what I was portraying here would incite somebody to assassinate or would be viewed as threatening the life of a president. I seriously doubt that they have that evidence, because if they did, they would have told the American public about that right away. And more
Right.
importantly, the indictment would have spoken to that,
Mm-hmm.
would have reflected that intent in some manner. So,
Yeah.
what else could they have possibly done
Right.
in a year?
No.
What
Right.
else
Well,
besides that?
right. It was not a very involved case, you would think. A lot of these cases have thousands or hundreds of thousands of documents and hundreds of witnesses. This scenario certainly shouldn't. There is definitely pressure on prosecutors, like from their supervisors, from the media, from the public, in this case politically, and There are guardrails on prosecutors, in the sense that there's some law, some statutes, some bar rules, some U.S. Supreme Court rulings that give the guardrails for, when a prosecutor is allowed to go forward with a case and when they shouldn't go forward with a case. Like they're supposed to have a likelihood of success at trial. But at the same time, we could do a whole episode one day on sovereign immunity. The prosecutor really, unless they commit a crime, they really can't be prosecuted. So I've had prosecutors, and when I was a prosecutor, I used to hear them say, you know what, this isn't the strongest case in the world, but I've got these victims that are calling me all day long. I'm afraid if I don't pursue the case, they're going to call my boss. I'm going to get, a reprimand. I'm going to get ridden up. I'm going to even get on probation, fired. I don't know. So I'm just going to pass the buck and put it in front of the judge and let the judge be the bad guy on this one. And, because I can pass the buck and put it in court, file the charges, and then I have sovereign immunity. So it is as you started this, one of the greatest systems in the world. But every system, there's flaws. There are flaws, but I wouldn't change it for any other system. And as we move into this other topic, you did say something earlier too when you referenced everyone free speech and all law students out there. But then you said, of course, most people would know this. It reminded me when you mentioned free speech has limits, and you mentioned law school in the same sentence. It reminded me of the example in law school, which is the limit of free speech is you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. So it's a really
Bad
good
example now. Nobody goes to the movie.
right post-COVID. You're right. Well, I don't. I was thinking about that. Was it crowd? Maybe you remember the case that I'm referring to, but I don't know if it was crowded movie theater, because even if there were only 10 people in there, you still shouldn't be allowed to. But because now you go to a movie theater post-COVID, there's only 5 other people in there with you. But anyway, I'm really, really glad you brought up this topic. We 95% of the time talk about our own cases, but it is valuable to talk about cases that are timely, like you said at the beginning, and cases that are in the news that people are interested in. So the topic, as our listeners are hearing now, is kind of government cases. I started with that question, which ironically turned out to be government related, because it says if you have a government fake ID. And now the one I'm going to talk about is actually involves the president, President Trump. So we just talked about President Trump. I've talked about him previously. We had an episode fairly recently with Amy Harris, who was federally prosecuted under the Biden administration for along with this topic today, that was clearly pushed through because of politics. Anyhow, today involving President Trump, but actually the defendant in the case was Corey Lewandowski. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, it can be because he's on a lot of the talk shows. He's a political pundit, so you'll see him often on the Sunday morning political news shows and in the nighttime as well. But he started the case that I was involved in, rose back in 2016. It was the first campaign for current President Trump. At the time, he was not a president. It was before his first term. And Corey Lewandowski was his campaign manager. So his name may sound familiar to a lot of you because of that as well. So in the first term and the first campaign, again, it was March of 2016. And at that time, it's really important to know that Trump was the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party for president. So he hadn't received the nomination yet from the Republican Party, but all indications were that he would be the nominee for the Republican Party going into the election. And Corey Lewandowski, in March of 2016, was arrested by the Jupiter Police Department. That's in Florida. It is in Palm Beach County, Florida. And he was arrested for battery. It was a simple battery. It was a misdemeanor. And the victim of the battery, when he was, was the police reports and the officer's testimony and so forth, was a journalist or a news reporter named Michelle Fields. Michelle, at the time, they believed that Michelle worked for Breitbart, which was a huge media outlet, covered a lot of political coverage and so forth. And so the police from Jupiter Police Department, they prepared these reports. They interviewed Breitbart employee Michelle Fields. Michelle Fields, by the way, didn't immediately file the report. I think it was like 3 days after the incident that she filed this police report with Jupiter Police. And what the police report said, and the witness, the lead officer who investigated and spoke to Mrs. Fields, it basically said that they were at a rally in Palm Beach County in 2016, and there was Mr. Trump at the time. Mr. Trump was walking at a good pace, moving forward. There were people moving forward by his side and so forth, and that it said that Corey Lewandowski had fallen behind him a little bit and started walking really fast to catch up to the president, or at the time, Mr. Trump. And in trying to get up to be by his side, because again, he's the campaign manager, they said to get his way up there, work his way up there, he pushed the reporter, Michelle Fields, out of the way, knocking her down. And, actually 2 or 3 days later when she came to the police department, showing that she had some bruises on her from being pushed and knocked down by Corey Lewandowski. That's what, the reports alleged. Now, the good news is there's film coverage of everything, right? Now, it was a rally, so there were cameras everywhere and video of the whole thing. So I actually get a call from President Mr. Trump at the time was flying on his plane to Wisconsin for a rally in Wisconsin. It was around 9 or 10 p.m. at night. It was a weeknight. And he calls me, he asks, to give me a call from the plane. I get a call from someone that's on the plane with President Mr. Trump. And they say, hey, you've seen this case? I said, yes, I have. They said, well, it was in the news at that point. They said, expect a call, from Corey. And I'm like, okay, thank you. Good to know. Appreciate that. And they also told me that Mr. Trump was going to be extremely public about his support for Corey Lewandowski, that he believes he's a fine man, that he did nothing wrong, that he never should have been charged by Jupiter Police, and so forth and so on. And really instantaneously, that started coming out in the news, where there were statements from President Trump, well, Mr. Trump at the time, again, sorry, I got to correct myself for clarity. Us lawyers always like to be clear, because words matter. So, so within seconds or minutes of that call, I started seeing a lot of social media and statements from Mr. Trump supporting Corey Lewandowski. That evening, maybe a few minutes, half hour later or so, I get a call from Corey Lewandowski about this case and talking about representation. So obviously we all know, all our listeners know, and anyone who hasn't tuned in before knows, there's attorney-client privilege, there's attorney-client confidentiality. In fact, at the end of our episode, there's a disclaimer at the end that says we're not able to reveal attorney-client privilege. We're complying with all bar rules, etc. So there's a lot I can't say. There's not only attorney-client privilege here, but I say a little bit tongue-in-cheek. There's like presidential privilege as well. But what I do is I call the elected district attorney. Well, in Florida, they're called state attorney. Almost every other state calls them DA or district attorney, but they're the same. They're the prosecutor. So at the time in Florida, the elected state attorney, the head prosecutor, was Dave Ehrenberg. He has since retired or moved into private practice after 2 terms as state attorney. Called him late at night, at least 10 p.m. on a weeknight, like I said. I think he was watching a Heat game, which I was watching as well. Fortunately, relationships are important when you practice law. I have his cell phone. I was able to give him a call. And it's really key in this case for people to understand that Dave was a Democrat. He was a very strong Democrat, highly respected Democrat. He had held other offices that he had been voted into as a Democrat. And I knew for a fact that a lot of his party was giving him pressure to pursue this case. It was a pretty contentious campaign. One party against the next, and Dave being on the Democratic side, his, party constituents would have loved to see his office go very aggressive and very hard at Corey Lewandowski, who was the campaign manager for the Republican presumptive nominee for President Donald Trump. So there was some political pressure, which ties into your whole comment, the topic today, Mark, that you picked, which is awesome. But it didn't really work here. The pressure didn't work. I got connected quickly the same evening with a state attorney, that would be actually an assistant state attorney. So the elected is this state attorney, Dave Ehrenberg. All the attorneys that work at his discretion, at State Attorney Ehrenberg's discretion, are called assistant state attorneys. So you hear of like a DA, and the ones that work for the DA are the ADA, assistant DA, or at the federal level, the U.S. attorney and the assistant U.S. attorney. That's the equivalent at the federal level. So I start hearing from them. I start communicating, open a dialogue that same evening, and in fact, this may be the shortest representation I ever had in my entire career. Again, starting around 9 p.m., winds up being over by about 11 p.m. or technically the next day around 9 a.m. So what happens is I start hearing from the the prosecutor that's looking at the case and so forth. And I want to back up for 1 second and explain how the system works. When police make an arrest in a situation like this, they create a filing packet. It's a package of information on the arrest, the witness statements, any video, all their evidence that they want to use. And then they bring it to the prosecutor's office and they say to a division called intake. And that department, the intake department or division, has a bunch of, in this case, assistant state attorneys who review files from police, filing packets, and they make a decision whether to file charges, not like a grand jury, but this is on a smaller level for misdemeanor. And they file the charges through a legal document called an information. It's the filing document. So there's a little bit of a limbo period between the officer, giving someone an arrest or, arresting them for the criminal case, and when the actual charges are filed. So we were in that limbo right now while I'm talking to the prosecutor, the assistant state attorney, about the case. And what they said they learned in the last several hours during the day about this case and now this is all alleged. I wasn't, I don't know these as facts, so I don't want to expose myself to any, libel or slander or anything. So I'm making it very clear this is the allegations, or this was the representations made to me from the prosecutor, the assistant state attorney, as to their understanding. They said they understood that that this victim, that she had crossed two Secret Service lines of, security lines, that she had breached them was their word. Two Secret Service security lines that she had breached while approaching Mr. Trump. That Corey Lewandowski knew that no one should have been there except for the security, the Secret Service, and Corey and Mr. Trump's team. No one else should have been in that space, and that Corey was aware of that. They said that Corey was not rushing to catch up to the president, that he was flanking him in his appropriate position, off to, I believe they said, his right shoulder, and that according to the assistant state attorney, the evidence that they had been reviewing, was that Corey saw in the corner of his eye this woman who he now realized that didn't belong there and had breached two security lines, had something in her hand that does not look like a cell phone, and it could have been some type of weapon of some sort. It was an unusual size and shape, and they were holding it up high and in a assertive, moving quickly way directly toward Mr. Trump, and in order to protect Mr. Trump, not knowing what this person was up to, since they had passed two security lines and had a weird object in their hand, that Corey Lewandowski pushed that person back and away from Mr. Trump. And they felt, this assistant state attorney, from what they had been viewing, felt that this was an appropriate behavior, I guess under the argument of defense of others, defense of the presumptive nominee, and so forth and so on. They also told me, and again, this is an allegation that I was represented to me. I don't know it as fact, so I'm just making it clear to the listeners that they also said that they had learned that, because it was part of thought, well, if they're a reporter, isn't there an exception for that? Shouldn't they be allowed to get up there and get a statement from Mr. Trump and so forth at this rally? Well, this is what they say they learned. They said they learned that this reporter had actually been fired from her job either earlier that day or the day before. Again, she worked for Breitbart, a media outlet. And again, I never confirmed that. I didn't look into that. I'm just repeating what was told to me, so I don't know it to be fact. But this was their understanding, that she was had been fired, that there were some concerns about her behavior and so forth, and then that possibly she was doing this to try to get her job back, that she was being super assertive, crossing the line literally twice, trying to get up there and get a statement from the presumptive nominee that maybe would help her either get her job back with Breitbart or maybe get her job somewhere else, showing what a great, investigative journalist she is. And so in my conversation, again, all that same evening, within a few hours, so now we're probably at 10:30, 11 p.m. at night, the prosecutor, assistant state attorney, tells me, despite the pressure we're getting from the Democratic Party and so forth, we are going to drop this case in the morning. We're going to enter what's called a no file. It goes back to the discussion I had a minute ago about the intake division. The prosecutor gets the filing packet from the officer, they review it, they have the right to do their own investigation, and then they make a decision on what criminal charges, if any, to file. And they told me on this call that they had made the decision that based on all this information, they don't think he should be charged, and they were going to no file the case, which means essentially drop the charges. So you think about like someone, he was arrested, it was in the news, it was, obviously damaging the reputation, it caused a lot of, issues for the campaign. No matter what side you're on, Democrat, Republican, neutral, doesn't matter. It was probably something that never should have gotten to that level whatsoever. It was possibly politically driven and so forth. But but those charges were dropped. I mean, it's interesting to know that some people say that it wasn't his first rodeo. That in recent years I've heard people say that because he did. There was a rally in Arizona with a Trump protester that Corey Lewandowski allegedly was physical with one of the protesters at a rally. Also, there was an incident in September of 21, which is a few years after 2016. But with Las Vegas, there were some prosecutors who had charged Corey with a battery stemming from some type of allegation of an unwanted sexual advance or contact with a woman at a charity dinner. And I believe those charges, were dropped as well. So, there are some people that I've heard say on this topic of Corey Lewandowski where there's smoke, there's fire. Other than that quick phone call I had with him, I have no knowledge of him or seeing him on TV. I have no personal experience or knowledge of him, but he was certainly a gentleman when I spoke to him. And, these are just things that other people have said, is that, again, where there's smoke, there's fire, which we hear. I think a lot of people on juries think that when they're sometimes not sure if someone's guilty or not, they think, well, there's enough evidence here, there's smoke, there must be fire. And sometimes as a defense lawyer, we have to be aware of that and make sure a jury doesn't come back with a guilty verdict when the government doesn't prove the case, but the jury thinks, well, there's smoke, so there must be fire, therefore we're going to convict. But at
Well,
the
can
end,
I? I
yeah,
want to interrupt you for a
yeah,
second.
please do. I'm wrapping it up
Um,
anyway.
that that's an excellent example of the prosecutor not bowing to political pressure, and obviously there was political pressure there. This time coming from the Democrats um, to prosecute a well-known Republican figure. And that is how the system is supposed to work. And kudos to Mr. Aronson and to those in his office who stood up and did the right thing. Does beg the question, what happens now in the Comey case? Why did the prosecutors, in this case, Mr. Blanche and others in the prosecutor's office, and specifically the U.S. attorney for I believe it's the Eastern District of North Carolina, why did they agree to prosecute a case that looks to be so factually and legally deficient? And we can only at this point surmise what the pressure may have been and that they may have bowed to it. I don't know, but it does raise serious concerns. And this is going to be debated on and on. We have had instances in our country where there has been direct political pressure
Mm.
on prosecutors to do certain things. If you date back to the Watergate affair or scandal, there was a appointed special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, was appointed to investigate the Watergate, not so much the break-in, but the cover-up
Right.
by the entire Nixon team, the administration, the members of the administration. And what happened is Nixon's team turned over summaries of tape recordings that Nixon had taped himself and taped everybody in the Oval Office. He had this system installed. I don't know if he installed it or was there before. In any event, Cox said, "No, I want the actual tapes." And in order to thwart this investigation, Nixon ordered the acting attorney general, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. Then his successor, William Ruckenhouse, his underling, who then became the acting attorney general, was ordered by Nixon to do that. He refused and he resigned. It was only the third person in line, Robert Bork, who then fired Cox. It started a legal firestorm, and Congress was considering articles of impeachment of Nixon. But it points out a very important aspect of what we're talking about, which is honorable prosecutors taking a stand against that which they believe or is an improper action ordered by, in that case, the president. And here we know that there have been a lot of resignations in the Justice Department in this new administration. And of course, we know that there are prosecutors who resigned, alleging that they were pressured to indict some of President Trump's political foes, and they refused because they didn't believe there was sufficient evidence. So, what was in the mind of the current prosecutors who brought this case? Did they actually believe that this was a legitimate case, or did they bow to political pressure?
Right.
No matter what, whether you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, we take no position here politically in this podcast. We're just reporting what the legal issues are. Regardless whether you're Republican or Democrat, it should be clearly understood that our system can only survive when it is administered fairly without political pressure. So we'll see what the outcome is going to be in the Comey case. In your particular case, Lewandowski case, the outcome was positive. It was reaffirming the Constitution and reaffirming the principles of this republic. We'll see what happens in the Comey case.
I love that. That's a perfect wrap up, Mark. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's why you're my mentor. All right.
I don't think I'm your mentor. You're my mentor.
All right. We make a great team. I think
Yeah.
I think that's what our viewers think as well. So I'll look forward to seeing you here in person soon, and
Yes.
we'll sign off for today. You ready?
Yes.
All right.
Until our next podcast, ladies and gentlemen, you are
Free to go. Everything expressed and discussed in this episode are the opinions and experiences of attorneys Guy Fronstin and Mark Nurick and their guests. All ethical rules are complied with. Attorney-client privilege and confidential information is not shared or released during these episodes, and names, dates, locations, and other identifying information may be changed to protect confidentiality. Topics are embellished, and none of the statements made constitute legal advice and should not be considered or relied on as such.